Story 1. Sarah had never felt more alone in her life. At 23, she had hoped for a brighter future, but after losing both her parents in a tragic car accident, the world seemed unbearably heavy. After a failed relationship and a dead-end job, she felt the weight of her loneliness growing. She had no one left. New York City's bustle couldn't drown out the void that had taken residence in her soul. But then came the letter. A distant, barely remembered aunt had passed away, leaving her the sole inheritor of an old house in a place called Elmwood, tucked away somewhere in rural Pennsylvania. Sarah didn't know what to make of it. Her aunt, Patricia, was a figure barely mentioned in family gatherings. But a place to escape the cold indifference of New York, even for a while, seemed appealing. The letter arrived at the perfect time. Chapter 1, The Journey Begins. The drive to Elmwood was long and exhausting, winding through endless miles of dense woods and mist-covered roads. Her GPS had given up long ago, forcing Sarah to rely on printed directions that led her deeper into isolation. By the time she reached Elmwood, dusk had already settled, casting long shadows over the town's deserted streets. The town looked frozen in time, with faded storefronts, old cars, and not a single soul in sight. It was eerie how empty it felt. The house stood on the outskirts of town, looming against the darkening sky. Sarah's first thought was that it looked more like a mansion than a house, with tall, gnarled trees lining the property, their branches twisted like skeletal fingers reaching toward the sky. The front gate creaked ominously as she pushed it open, the sound echoing in the stillness. The house was old, but not in a charming, rustic way. Its decayed exterior showed years of neglect. The windows were cracked, the front door paint peeled, and the roof sagged in places. But despite its state, something about the house drew her in, a pull she couldn't explain. Chapter 2, The First Night. The inside of the house was just as decrepit. Dust coated everything, and the musty smell of age hung in the air. She found the electricity still worked, though barely, casting dim light through ancient, flickering bulbs. The furniture was covered in white sheets, but underneath, she could see glimpses of a life once lived here. As she wandered through the house, she noticed small things that unsettled her: an old mirror in the hallway reflecting her distorted image, portraits of unknown relatives with blank eyes that seemed to follow her, and the faint sound of footsteps on the floor above when she knew she was alone. That night, she lay awake in the guest bedroom, trying to ignore the strange noises, creaking floorboards, whispers carried on the wind, and the distant sound of someone sobbing. But the most unnerving part was the feeling of being watched, a constant pressure on her chest that wouldn't go away. The whispers grew louder as the hours passed, incoherent but persistent, like a conversation just out of reach. She buried her head under the covers, convincing herself it was just her mind playing tricks. It wasn't. Chapter 3, The Whispering Walls. The next morning, Sarah explored more of the house. The basement door was locked, but she found a rusty key on the kitchen counter, as if it had been placed there deliberately. The stairs leading down were steep, the light switch flickering before plunging her into darkness. Her flashlight beam danced across the stone walls, revealing strange markings etched into the surface, symbols she didn't recognize. A chill ran down her spine. The air felt colder here, heavier. As she reached the center of the room, she found an old journal lying on the ground, its cover worn and frayed. She hesitated before picking it up, her fingers brushing the cold leather. The journal belonged to her Aunt Patricia, its pages filled with frantic scribblings, warnings about the house and the thing that lived inside it. According to the entries, Patricia had become obsessed with the idea that something inhuman resided in the house. The final entry was barely legible, a rambling message about the walls whispering secrets and something called the Watcher. As she closed the journal, the whispers started again, this time louder, more insistent. Sarah's heart raced. She turned toward the door, only to see it slowly close on its own. Panic surged through her as she sprinted up the stairs, slamming the door behind her. Something was down there, and it didn't want her to leave. Chapter 4, The Watcher. Over the next few days, the sense of dread in the house grew. The whispers became a constant presence, growing louder at night, wrapping around her like a suffocating blanket. She saw fleeting shadows moving in the corners of her vision, and the footsteps above her room continued, always in pairs as if someone, or something, was pacing, waiting for her. She tried to leave, but the town's roads seemed to twist and turn back on themselves, leading her in circles. It was as if Elmwood didn't want her to leave, as if the house had claimed her. On the third night, she woke to the sound of heavy breathing coming from the foot of her bed. She froze, too terrified to move. Slowly, she opened her eyes, and in the dim light, she saw it, a figure standing at the end of her bed, its face obscured by shadows, watching her. The room was freezing, her breath visible in the air. She wanted to scream, but her voice was trapped in her throat. Story 2. The night was still. An eerie quiet blanketed the world, broken only by the occasional creak of the old house. Emily sat on the edge of her bed, staring into the darkened hallway, listening to the hum of nothingness. She had never been one to believe in ghosts or monsters, but ever since she moved into the old farmhouse, she couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't quite right. She had moved to the countryside just 3 months ago, fleeing the chaos of New York City after the sudden death of her parents. The farmhouse was a remnant of her family's past, long abandoned, but still standing, just like Emily. Her great-grandparents had lived here, but no one had touched it for decades. When she inherited it, she thought it would be a place to start over, a quiet refuge. But instead, it had become her prison. At first, the odd noises she heard at night could be attributed to the age of the house. Wooden beams settled and shifted, causing groans and creaks to ripple through the walls. But soon, the sounds became more deliberate, footsteps pacing in the attic, the low murmur of voices in the empty rooms, the scraping of something sharp against the floorboards. Emily began to feel watched, even though she was the only one living there. It was just her imagination, she told herself. She was grieving. She was alone. Her mind was playing tricks. But tonight felt different. The darkness around her seemed to pulse with a life of its own. Emily had gone to bed early, exhausted from another restless night, but something had woken her. It was subtle at first, just a light tapping sound coming from the hallway. She opened her eyes to see the shadows dancing, as though something moved just out of sight. Tap. 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 The noise was growing louder, more insistent. Emily's heart quickened, her breaths shallow. She gripped her phone tightly, but the clock read 3:13 a.m., and there was no service this far from town. Her hand trembled as she reached for the flashlight on her nightstand, casting a weak beam of light toward the door. The tapping stopped. In the stillness, she strained her ears, listening for anything out of place. The house seemed to breathe around her, the walls expanding and contracting with every gust of wind. She shook her head, trying to push the fear down. "It's nothing," she whispered to herself. "Just the house." But she couldn't shake the feeling that something was in the hallway, waiting. Unable to bear it any longer, Emily threw off the blankets and crept toward the door. Her feet were silent on the worn wooden floor as she peered out into the dark hallway. The flashlight flickered, casting brief glimpses of old family portraits and peeling wallpaper. There was no sign of anything unusual. And then she heard it. Whispering. Faint and disjointed, the sound came from the attic. Emily froze. She had never been up there. The thought of the dusty old attic filled her with dread. She imagined it stuffed with forgotten relics, decayed memories of a family she barely knew. But tonight, someone, was up there. Her heart pounded as she stood at the base of the attic stairs, looking up into the yawning darkness above. The whispering continued, growing louder and more distinct. It sounded like a woman's voice, faint but melodic, as if calling her name. Against her better judgment, Emily reached for the old rope that hung from the attic hatch and pulled. The hatch creaked open, the ladder unfolding with a shuddering groan. She pointed the flashlight up the stairs, the beam slicing through the dark. Dust motes floated in the air like tiny, ghostly apparitions. "Hello?" Emily's voice was barely a whisper. She didn't expect an answer. But she got one. "Come up," the voice beckoned. Emily's breath hitched. Her legs felt like lead, but she couldn't stop herself from ascending the ladder. Each step felt heavier than the last, the air around her growing colder. As her head rose above the floor of the attic, the flashlight revealed the room, cluttered with old furniture, cobwebs, and the lingering scent of decay. In the corner, she saw it, an old rocking chair, gently swaying back and forth. Emily swallowed hard, stepping fully into the attic. Her flashlight flickered again, casting strange, distorted shadows across the room. The whispering grew louder, almost rhythmic now, but she couldn't pinpoint its source. The rocking chair creaked in the corner, and Emily's gaze fixed on it, unable to look away. And then the chair stopped moving. The whispering stopped. The silence was deafening. Emily's heart hammered in her chest as she took a step toward the chair, her flashlight trembling in her hand. She knew she shouldn't go any closer, but it was as if something was pulling her in. She reached out, fingertips brushing the back of the chair. A cold, icy hand closed around her wrist. Emily screamed, yanking her hand back, stumbling away from the chair. The flashlight clattered to the floor, spinning wildly, casting disorienting beams of light around the attic. She scrambled backward, her back hitting a dusty chest. Her breaths came in panicked gasps, but the attic was still again, the air thick with tension. And then she heard the voice again, right behind her ear, so close she could feel the chill of its breath. "Help me." Emily whirled around, but there was no one there. The attic was empty, save for the forgotten belongings of a bygone era. Her flashlight had rolled to a stop near the ladder, the light weak and fading. She had to get out. Now. But as she reached for the ladder, the attic door slammed shut, plunging her into total darkness. She screamed again, pounding on the hatch, but it wouldn't budge. The air around her grew colder, and she could feel someone, moving behind her. She spun around, pressing herself against the ladder, her eyes wide in the pitch black. "Who are you? What do you want?" Her voice was barely audible, shaking with terror. For a long moment, there was nothing but silence. Then, from the darkness, the voice came again, soft and sad. "I was forgotten." The words sent a shiver down Emily's spine. She clutched the ladder, her knuckles white. "What do you mean?" There was a pause, and then the whispering began again, filling the attic with its haunting melody. Images flooded Emily's mind, flashes of a woman's life, long ago. She saw a young woman, alone in the farmhouse, waiting for someone who never came. The woman grew older, her hope fading, until she was just a shadow, wandering the halls, forgotten by the world. "I was left here," the voice whispered, "closer now. Alone. Just like you." Emily felt tears prick at her eyes, her fear mingling with a strange, overwhelming sadness. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice trembling. The whispering stopped. For a moment, there was nothing but the sound of Emily's ragged breathing. And then, slowly, the attic door creaked open, spilling weak moonlight into the room. Emily hesitated for a moment, her heart still pounding, before scrambling down the ladder, her legs barely holding her up. She ran to her room, slamming the door behind her. She didn't sleep the rest of the night, her ears straining for any sound, but the house was silent. The whispers were gone. In the morning, Emily packed her things. She couldn't stay in the house any longer. As she was about to leave, she glanced back at the house one last time, her eyes drawn to the attic window. For a split second, she thought she saw the outline of a figure standing there, watching her. But when she blinked, it was gone. The last night. The old house on the hill had been abandoned for as long as anyone in town could remember. It stood tall and dark against the skyline, its windows like hollow eyes gazing out over the empty field below. People whispered about it, traded stories of strange happenings and ghosts that wandered its halls, but no one ever dared to go inside. Except for Lydia. She had always been drawn to places like this. The house was a mystery, and she was never one to shy away from the unknown. So, when she found herself alone on a cold autumn evening, with the sun just beginning to dip below the horizon, she decided to do what no one else in town had the courage to do: explore the old house. The air was crisp as Lydia made her way up the winding path that led to the front door. The grass was overgrown, the trees twisted and bare, their branches like skeletal arms reaching for the sky. The house loomed larger as she approached, its wooden beams creaking in the wind, the shutters hanging crooked on their hinges. As she reached the door, Lydia hesitated for a moment. Her hand hovered over the rusted doorknob, her breath catching in her throat. She had heard the rumors, about the girl who died here, about the family who vanished without a trace. But she didn't believe in ghosts. Not really. With a deep breath, Lydia pushed the door open. It creaked loudly, the sound echoing through the empty halls. Dust filled the air, swirling in the faint light that filtered through the cracked windows. The air was thick with age, with the weight of all the years that had passed since anyone had last set foot inside. Lydia stepped over the threshold, her footsteps soft on the creaky wooden floor. The house was eerily quiet, the kind of silence that pressed down on you, made you feel like you were intruding. She glanced around, taking in the faded wallpaper, the cobwebs that hung from the ceiling, the old furniture covered in white sheets like ghosts waiting to be awakened. The house was cold. Much colder than it should have been for late autumn. As she moved deeper into the house, a strange feeling began to settle over her. It was subtle at first, a prickling at the back of her neck, a slight tightening in her chest. But with each step she took, it grew stronger, more oppressive. The air felt thicker, as though something was watching her, waiting. She stopped in front of a large, ornate mirror that hung on the wall of the foyer. The glass was cracked, but she could still see her reflection staring back at her. For a moment, she thought she saw something move in the background, a shadow flickering just behind her shoulder. She spun around, but there was nothing there. Just the empty house. "Hello?" Lydia called out, her voice barely above a whisper. She wasn't expecting a response. But she got one. A soft, almost imperceptible whisper echoed through the halls, carried on a breath of cold air. It was faint, just at the edge of hearing, but Lydia could have sworn it sounded like someone whispering her name. She felt a chill run down her spine, her heartbeat quickening. Is someone there? Silence. Lydia swallowed hard, forcing herself to take another step forward. She wouldn't let herself get scared. Not yet. She had come here to explore, to prove that there was nothing to fear. But as she moved through the house, the strange feeling of being watched grew stronger. Every shadow seemed to flicker in the corners of her vision, every creak of the old house sounded like footsteps just behind her. She could feel the weight of the silence pressing down on her, suffocating her, wrapping her in an invisible grip. She reached the staircase at the center of the house. It was grand, winding up into the second floor, its wooden steps worn smooth from years of use. Something about the staircase called to her, urged her to climb it. Her hand gripped the banister, and without thinking, she began to ascend. The further she climbed, the colder the air became. By the time she reached the top, her breath was visible in front of her, tiny clouds of condensation in the freezing air. Her skin prickled with goosebumps, and she wrapped her arms around herself, trying to ward off the cold. The hallway stretched out before her, long and narrow, lined with doors on either side. Most of them were closed, but one at the far end was slightly ajar, a sliver of darkness spilling out from behind it. Lydia stared at the door, her pulse pounding in her ears. She didn't want to go toward it, but something was pulling her, something beyond her control. Her legs felt heavy as she moved down the hall, each step echoing in the silence. As she reached the door, she hesitated. A strange smell wafted through the crack, something sweet and rotten, like decaying flowers. Her stomach turned, but she pushed the door open. The room was dark, the air thick with dust and something far more unsettling. The floorboards creaked underfoot as Lydia stepped inside. Her eyes adjusted to the gloom, and she saw it, a bed in the center of the room, its canopy tattered and sagging, the sheets still pulled tight as though someone had just made the bed. But the most disturbing part was what lay beneath the covers. There was a figure there, curled up on its side, the outline of a small body barely visible under the faded blanket. Lydia's breath caught in her throat as she moved closer, her hand trembling as she reached for the edge of the sheet. She didn't want to look. Every fiber of her being screamed for her to turn around and run. But she had to know. With a quick motion, Lydia yanked the sheet back. What she saw made her blood run cold. The figure beneath the blanket was a girl, no older than 12, her skin pale and waxy, her eyes wide open, staring up at the ceiling in a blank, lifeless gaze. Her hair was tangled and matted, her lips blue, her limbs twisted in unnatural angles. Lydia stumbled back, her hand flying to her mouth as bile rose in her throat. She had heard the stories about the girl who had died in the house, but she hadn't believed them. She thought they were just tales to scare children. But here she was. Dead. Forgotten. And then, the girl moved. Her head snapped toward Lydia, her cold, dead eyes locking onto hers. A low, guttural sound escaped her throat, and she began to sit up, her limbs jerking unnaturally as though controlled by invisible strings. Story 3. Echoes in the walls. The rain fell in sheets, slashing against the windows of the isolated house where Madeline sat alone. Thunder rumbled in the distance, rolling through the empty fields that surrounded the old property. The wind howled, pressing its cold breath against the aging glass, as though it wanted to get inside and bring the storm with it. Madeline hugged her knees to her chest, sitting curled up on the worn couch in the living room. The house felt impossibly large and empty, every creak of the floorboards and groan of the timbers amplified by the hollow silence. She was used to being alone. Her parents had passed a few years ago, leaving her this house, an inheritance she was never quite sure she wanted. She had lived here for the past year, slowly acclimating to the solitude, but tonight something felt different. The power had gone out over an hour ago, plunging the house into darkness. Madeline had lit a few candles, but their flickering glow did little to ease the sense of foreboding that had settled over her. The house seemed alive in the storm, groaning and whispering in ways that set her on edge. She stood up and moved to the window, peering out into the night. The rain was relentless, turning the field into a sea of mud. The wind whipped the trees into a frenzy, their branches clawing at the sky like desperate hands. She sighed and leaned her forehead against the cold glass, hoping the storm would pass soon. And that's when she heard it. A faint sound, barely audible over the howling wind and pounding rain. It was coming from upstairs, an odd, rhythmic tapping, like fingernails rapping against wood. Madeline froze, her heart skipping a beat. The house was supposed to be empty. She turned slowly, listening intently. The sound continued, persistent and unsettling, as though someone, or something, was inside the house with her. Her rational mind told her it was probably nothing. Old houses made strange noises, especially in storms like this. But deep down, she knew this was different. The tapping grew louder, more insistent, as though whoever was making it wanted her attention. She stared up at the ceiling, her pulse quickening. The sound was coming from her parents' old bedroom. No one had entered that room since they passed, not even her. She had kept the door locked, unable to bring herself to go inside, haunted by the memories. But now, something was in there. Madeline grabbed a candle, the only source of light she had, and started toward the staircase. Her feet felt heavy, as though the air around her had thickened, slowing her down. The shadows danced on the walls as she climbed the stairs, her heart pounding in her chest. When she reached the top of the stairs, the sound stopped. She stood at the threshold of the hallway, her candle flickering in the dark. The door to her parents' room stood at the far end, closed as it had always been. But something about the air felt wrong, like a cold, invisible presence had settled over the house. The hairs on the back of her neck stood on end, and a chill seeped into her bones. Madeline's breath caught in her throat as she took a step forward. The tapping sound began again, louder this time, more frantic. Her pulse quickened, her fingers trembling as she held the candle aloft. She could feel something watching her, something waiting behind the door. She reached the end of the hall, staring at the door, her hand hovering over the handle. The tapping stopped again, replaced by an eerie silence that pressed against her eardrums. She stood frozen, unsure of what to do. Every instinct in her body screamed at her to turn around, to go back downstairs, to leave the house. But something was drawing her closer, a force she couldn't resist. With a trembling hand, she grasped the cold metal of the doorknob and twisted. The door creaked open, revealing the dark, dusty room beyond. Her candle flickered, casting long shadows across the floor and walls. The air was thick with the smell of damp wood and decay, the scent of a room long untouched by light. Her parents' bed sat in the middle of the room, still made as if waiting for their return. Everything was just as it had been left. But there, in the corner of the room, stood something she did not expect. It was a chair, a small, antique rocking chair, one that had belonged to her mother. She had forgotten it even existed, tucked away in the corner like a relic of a past life. But now, it was rocking. Slowly. Back and forth. Madeline's breath caught in her throat. The chair moved on its own, the rhythmic creaking matching the tapping sound she had heard earlier. There was no breeze in the room, no logical reason for it to be moving. She took a step closer, her heart hammering in her chest, her candle casting long, distorted shadows on the walls. And then, she saw her. A figure sat in the rocking chair, barely visible in the dim light. The shadow of a woman, her hair long and matted, her form hunched as if weighed down by some terrible sorrow. Madeline's candle flickered again, and for the briefest moment, she saw the woman's face, pale and sunken, eyes hollow and black as coal. The woman's lips parted, and a soft, raspy voice filled the room. "You left me." Madeline's blood ran cold. The voice was familiar, achingly so. It was her mother's voice, but twisted, broken, as though it came from a place far beyond the grave. "Mom?" Madeline whispered, her voice trembling. "Is that you?" The figure in the chair didn't move, but the rocking slowed, the creaking now the only sound in the room. The air felt heavy, oppressive, as though the walls themselves were closing in on her. "You left me," the voice repeated, more insistent this time. "You promised you wouldn't." Madeline's mind raced. Her mother had died suddenly, slipping away one night without warning, leaving Madeline alone in the world. She had tried to forget, to move on, but now, here in this room, her mother's presence was undeniable. "I didn't mean to," Madeline whispered, tears welling in her eyes. "I didn't know." The figure in the chair rocked faster now, the creaking growing louder, more frantic. The shadows in the room seemed to pulse, closing in on her, suffocating her. Madeline backed away, her candle flickering wildly as the temperature in the room plummeted. Suddenly, the rocking stopped. The figure stood, its movements jerky and unnatural, like a puppet on strings. Madeline froze, her breath caught in her throat as the figure turned toward her. The woman's face was fully visible now, her skin deathly pale, her eyes empty sockets, black and endless. If you like this scary horror video, subscribe my YouTube channel for more new interesting scary video. Thank you.